Good evening, Rowan. It's the 28th of December 2015 and it's just before midnight, and I'm making you another lovely video because I don't want you missing me over the Christmas season. So I thought I'd talk a little bit more about your bizarre lecture about Christmas at St Paul's Cathedral. So I'll get right on with it, because I don't want to be faffing about at this late hour, and I did make you quite a long video last night, so I hope you appreciated that, as well as my very thoughtful Christmas greetings. So here's what you say. The first thing we learn about St Joseph was that he was a good chap, an upright person, and because he was an upright person, he didn't want to marry Mary. And so, one of the things Matthew chapter 1 tells us is that maybe uprightness isn't the end of the story here. And that's all you say about that story. So I'm just going to look at Matthew chapter 1 here and see what the story's really about. So, this is Matthew chapter 1, and the story that you're talking about starts at verse 18 and goes on to the end of the chapter. So, this is what it says. Now the birth of Jesus the Messiah took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. So this is why, one of the ways that Joseph was a righteous man, he didn't want to embarrass Mary or expose her to public disgrace. So when he found out that she was pregnant, he naturally assumed that she'd been unfaithful to him, and this is why he wanted to break off the engagement. But because he was a righteous man, he didn't want to do it in a very public way. He wanted to protect her from public disgrace, so he planned to do it quietly. And probably, this is me speculating, he would think, oh well, the man who's the father of the child could marry her. That's probably what an upright man would be thinking in those circumstances. But that's just my speculation. But anyway, so that's why Joseph was planning not to marry Mary, because he thought she was pregnant by another man. It wasn't because he thought she wasn't good enough for him, or he discovered that she was poorer than he thought she was, or that he found another woman, or anything like that. It was because he found out she was pregnant, and he naturally assumed, as anybody would, that another man was the father, because he knew it wasn't him. So that's why he planned to break off the engagement, and because he was an upright man, he decided to do it quietly rather than publicly disgrace Mary. So he planned to do that, and then reading from verse 20, it says, "But just when he had resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, 'Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins.' And this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophets. 'Look, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel,' which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife." So that's how Joseph came to marry Mary, after he had decided to break off the engagement, because he was naturally assuming that it was another man who was the child's father, and then an angel appeared and said, "No, the child is of the Holy Spirit." So he shouldn't worry about marrying Mary, because she hadn't been unfaithful to him with another man. And so Joseph wouldn't be reasonably supposing that the father of the child could actually marry her instead. So this is how he came to marry her after he'd decided not to marry her. So you say, and so one of the things Matthew chapter 1 tells us is that maybe uprightness isn't the end of the story. Well, in fact, on the contrary. Matthew chapter 1 tells us that uprightness is the end of the story. You're still trying to squirm out of it, aren't you, Rowan? You're still being manipulative. Oh, you know, anyone who complains about your immoral behaviour, there's something wrong with them, especially if it's me. There's something wrong with me. Because I constantly point out your disgusting, abusive and immoral behaviour and the fact that you're a psychopath and you are a narcissist, you have narcissistic delusions, and I'm not going to involve myself with you. I have freedom of association. I don't have to associate with anybody I don't want to. It's not a sin to decide not to associate with people, and particularly it's pretty foolish to associate with people that you know are so abusive and that you know are just going to treat you exactly the same way again, and that they're only trying to manipulate you to get the outcome that they want. Plus, I wouldn't want to give you a shred of credibility by even saying hello to you. I'm not going to say anything to you apart from condemning your disgusting abusive behaviour and all the lies that you tell until you start telling the truth about what you've done and said. Tell the truth about it. Tell the truth about it. Stop blaming your victims. Stop trying to make out there's something wrong with people who criticise you. There isn't. There's something wrong with you. Anyway, I shall leave that there for the moment, and then I'll go on to the next quotation in a minute.
Questions come in saying 2 of the gospel writers weren't interested in nativity stories. Why should we be?
That's a very good question. First of all, because they're very good stories, and we need good stories. And I think they're good stories for a number of reasons. Look at St. Matthew's version. The first thing we learn about St. Joseph is that he was a good chap. He was an upright man. And so, of course, being an upright person, he didn't want to marry Mary. And so one of the things that Matthew chapter 1 tells us is maybe uprightness isn't the end of the story here.
So I'm now going to move on to the next thing that you said, where you're talking about chapter 2 of Matthew's Gospel, and you say that chapter 2 portrays exotic and rather dangerous characters. Not so much we 3 kings of Orient as 3 druids or shamans. They're really strange figures, New-Agey figures, turning up out of nowhere, as if to say, the first people who recognise what's going on are the least likely people. So, you're making this speech the day after I said not to be identifying with anyone in the Christmas story apart from King Herod, because you exterminate anyone who you think might be a threat to you. It's not just me who said that you surround yourself with incompetent people, by the way. That is in your biography, and there are interviews with people on YouTube as well who say the same thing about you, so it's not just me. So they're not particularly saying you exterminate anyone who might be a threat to you, but you certainly don't want any competent people close to you, because they'd notice what kind of person you are, wouldn't they? And they'd notice how incompetent you are. So this is why you exterminate those you think may be threatening, and you also promote people who you know will be useless. And that's not just me saying that. Many other people have said it as well, although I think it's a deliberate strategy, and I'm not sure that everybody else realises that, because you're being puppeteered as well, aren't you? So undermining the establishment, the organisation, is part of your goal anyway, but you are naturally inclined towards that kind of behaviour. So you're clearly identifying here with these 3 kings of Orient, or 3 druids, or shamans, because you are actually a druid, aren't you? You have been initiated, if that's the right word, into something in Wales, the Gorsedd of Bards or something like that, which is something to do with promoting Welsh culture and language. I don't know a great deal about it, but you turned up in white regalia and you were initiated into this, and I think other prominent Welsh figures are members of this body as well. And if anybody doesn't believe that you're a druid, I'm going to put a link in so they can check it out, but you are actually a druid. So you're identifying yourself here with these characters who turned up to pay homage to Jesus and to give him gifts, rather than King Herod, who tried to exterminate him because he felt threatened when these people, whether they were kings or astrologers or wise men or magi, however you want to describe them, they turned up and told King Herod that they were looking for the new king who'd been born, because they'd seen his star. This is how Herod came to know about Jesus' existence, and they went off to find him, and Herod told them to return and tell him where he was, but they didn't do that. They went home by a different way, and that's why Herod ended up killing all the male children under 2 in Bethlehem, in the region of Bethlehem. They were really strange figures, New-Agey figures. Well, I've shown videos about the emergent church and the merging of New Age ideas with Christianity, which is actually a takeover of Christianity by the New Age in the emergent church, which is what you promote. Although you're trying to make out that they're your own ideas, but they're not. You're just parroting them off a script, aren't you? So you're clearly comparing yourself to these characters. So you say they're really strange figures, New-Agey figures, turning up out of nowhere, as if to say the first people who recognise what's going on are the least likely people. Well, my final point on this is to say that just because someone recognises what's going on, that doesn't commend them. Recognising what's going on isn't a virtue, because psychopaths recognise what's going on, because they spend all their time studying other people in order to find out what their weak points are so that they can manipulate them and sometimes destroy and eliminate them from organisations and destroy their reputation and all this kind of thing. So recognising what's going on in itself isn't a virtue, because after all, King Herod recognised what was going on. Otherwise he wouldn't have bothered to murder all those children, would he? If he hadn't recognised what was going on, he wouldn't have bothered to murder those children. So recognising what is going on isn't a virtue, and it doesn't commend a person in itself, because this recognition can be used for evil purposes, as your life well demonstrates. And I would also like to say that these people may have recognised what was going on, and they clearly didn't have murderous intentions towards Jesus, because they sought him out and they paid homage to him and they gave him gifts, and then they went home a different way and they didn't tell King Herod where he was. So they didn't have any bad intentions towards him. But at the same time, they weren't the people who Jesus sent out to preach the gospel, were they? They were the apostles and the 70 evangelists who he sent out first to the house of Israel and then to all nations to preach the gospel. And these were people who knew the teaching of Jesus and were faithful to it, and they went out and proclaimed the gospel to all nations. So these are the people that Jesus commissioned, apostles and evangelists. He didn't commission really strange figures, New-Agey figures, 3 druids or shamans. There weren't 3 of them, by the way. We don't know how many there were. There might have been 10 of them. There were 3 gifts. That's why people think of 3 kings or 3 wise men, because there were 3 gifts. There could have been any number. So they weren't the ones Jesus sent out to preach the gospel to all nations. So it wasn't just people who recognised him. It was people who listened to his teaching, understood his teaching, and went out and proclaimed it. People like the apostles Jesus chose in his lifetime, and people who came after them as well, like St. Paul, for example. These are the people that Jesus commissioned to preach the gospel to all nations, not New-Agey types. So you've ruled yourself out again, haven't you? Anyway, public transport's going to be back to normal tomorrow, so be alert. Hasta la próxima.
And then Matthew goes on with the very, very challenging second chapter, which first of all portrays these exotic and rather dangerous characters, not so much we 3 kings of Orient, as 3 druids or shamans. They're really strange figures, New-Agey figures, turning up out of nowhere, as if to say, the first people who recognize what's going on are the least likely people.